Okay. All right. Well, hello, welcome. I'm here with Essay Delendum again, and this time we're going to talk about presentism. So, do you want to start off? Well, just introduce yourself, obviously, and then tell us
Well, okay,
what
yeah,
presentism is, because I don't think I was new to the word when you wrote to me. I was like, okay, let's talk about that, but I didn't know what it meant. So, give it like maybe a brief
yeah. This
definition.
well, okay. So first off, I'm honored to be back on the Agon with Raymond K. Hessel, or senior research fellow, as done these talks several times before. And yeah, so it's like the engram. If you look at the Google engram on presentism, it's just totally exploding. It's like there's a few usages, like in 1980 to 2000, and then past 2000, it's like it just goes straight up. And so this concept is, I think, it's kind of proliferating. But I think it can be linked back to a strictly philosophical concept called actualismus, like which I have a Heidegger citation of him, of the translator translates actualismus as currentism, but I think it could as well be
It's
translated as
so I Googled it
presentism.
and it says it's like uncritical adherence to like contemporary values, if that makes sense. Is that
So,
good?
I mean, yeah, different. So, I mean, one thing I would way to approach it, I think, is like we have these words bias, prejudice, and uh, tendency. That I have like some citations for all of those to show kind of how the grammar of them in Wittgenstein's sense kind of overlap. So let me say something that kind of sets up for the way for my way of analyzing this is like Wittgenstein gives the example of how he understands the word grammar through saying somebody listens to a Bach concert and they come out and they say, uh, I can't remember, like that was delightful, I think. And then the other guy says, I wouldn't have used that word. I would have said uh, glorious. So he thinks that the concept of glorious is more, it fits better Bach's music, right? So the grammar is like that. So then we have all these different, it's like, where does the word prejudice fit? Where does the word bias fit? Where does the word tendency fit? I think those all kind of overlap. And I have some examples of that in German. Prejudice is Vorurteil. The Urteil is kind of set against Meinung, which is sometimes translated as opinion, but I think it's like Offenliche Meinung means like public. It's like public opinion in a way, but it's not exactly opinion. I think there's like some grammar problems there too in the way it fits. But basically, Vorurteil is basically Nietzsche's is at close to the essence of Nietzsche because it's like he's all the time he's saying basically um, uh, you can't no instead of the truth you everybody has their prejudice or some kind of bias or some kind of they're following some kind of tendency. And you
Okay,
could
yeah.
one way to say this is like Jung says this without really Jung is aware of Hegel and all that stuff, but he kind of says it basically as though there were no history. And he says, like, if there's a personal quality that colors all our access to reality, then the only way would be something like that Indian thing about the blind man and the elephant or something like that. There would be different sides or whatever. That's kind of the way Jung handles it. But I think with Nietzsche, yeah, it's a little bit different, but that gives a little bit of the flavor of this. There's always the prejudice. And then Nietzsche says basically there's uh, intelligent or like fair prejudices, which I think I kind of link up to Wittgenstein's idea of the uh, epistemological peers. So like people that are roughly of the same ability and roughly informed in about the same way, but then they come out with totally different views on the matter. Those are epistemological peers. There's where you could get like intelligent differences in the prejudice. And then there'd be unintelligent prejudices. And it's a little bit, it reminds me of how the way Zizek all the time calls everyone an idiot. And then he says, but there's like the real idiots, and then there's like idiots like me, Zizek, and a few other people. So it's a little bit like that, I think.
Okay, yeah. So it's like, so I suppose it's kind of an analysis of kind of inclinations and prejudices, thought patterns, assumptions, axioms, all that kind of stuff, but like within a temporal framework. So we're trying to understand how different time periods have certain kind of styles of inclinations or prejudices. So I'll give you an anecdotal example. I thought maybe you can tell me if this is a good example of presentism. So I was watching a documentary about this guy called I think his name's Romulus, something like this. He was basically like a 6th century Irish monk, okay? And he went over to Europe, like to France and Germany. He set up in Italy. He set up loads of monasteries. So he's kind of known as one of the first people that conceived of the idea of Europe. So anyway, so because he came from Ireland, uh, the old Irish president, the president in Ireland is different to the prime minister. The prime minister is the political position of power. The president's a kind of they have some kind of legal power, but it's more a kind of figurehead position. But anyway, the old president of Ireland made a documentary about this Irish monk called Romulus. And the whole time she was trying to frame Romulus as if, I think she literally said Romulus was an example of pluralistic values. And she even said in this kind of little rhetorical passage, sexual diversity. And I was like, okay, hold the fucking phone here. Like, do you really think a 6th century Irish monk would have been like, because he had an idea of Europe as a unified kind of Christian entity, would have been kind of okay with the 21st century kind of progressive kind of norms of globalization or something like that. It was a really remarkable example of like projecting contemporary values onto like a 6th century monk, which is kind of extreme, right? So I don't know, is it like that, is that
So
sort
I
of
guess
way,
like
is
yeah,
that a good
absolutely,
example?
but I guess there's different ranges of it. So like
Yeah.
there's a question of like when do we go? So the real thesis of Hegel is so Hegel is basically the hard relativist because he defines this notion of the zeitgeist, and zeitgeist is specific to, let's say, for instance, the time of German idealism. So Heidegger says there's this Dasein and time of German idealism, which possibly is, I don't know how far to reach the ambit of it, but maybe 1730 to 1831, the death of Hegel. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's bigger, but it's like there's certain demands people feel during that, and there's a certain grammar that people share in that period. And the question is like, is so Hegel's idea is knowledge is always relative to the time, but it's okay because we're in the absolute time where we have the perfect expression of knowledge. But basically, this thesis that knowledge is relative to the time is the same as, I think, it's almost the same as presentism. And that starts with, that's Hegel's thesis. And I use the word Zeitalter or age. There's different ages. And then this is like, somebody claimed Hegel didn't actually use that. Schelling used it, not Hegel. I don't know, but it's basically the concept is in, I think it's almost the same as the zeitgeist concept in Hegel. But the thing is, yeah, knowledge is relative to the time. But then I think there's this question of what are the intelligent um, versions where somebody tries to give an account of a time, and where is it that they go astray and just become political activists or something? Or is that even the way to frame the question? Let me, I have a bunch of citations which I kind of throw in. I'll try to kind of throw in here and there, even though they might not be exactly speaking to what you just said, but just I think compounding they'll accrue and the more sense will come of it. So I have a citation from the time of the Franco-Prussian War, which is the same time when Nietzsche wrote this, the three history thing, which comes from a book actually called Unzeitgenazen Betrachtungen, which is something like observations that don't fit the time. So from the same time as this Franco-Prussian War period, like 1871 or so, the same time Dostoevsky came out with this, and this is sort of part of the standard version of presentism, I think. Zizek has something on this on RT. Like for a short time, Zizek was writing these little pieces on RT right before the current unpleasantness in the Ukraine, I think. And then actually Tucker Carlson, I think, probably picked up on that, and he did a little thing. I'm not sure if he did it while he was still at Fox or if he did it when he got his own platform. But it's basically all they say is like the selection of facts determines the tendency of how you're going to understand things, and then you can kind of remove some or put some more in. I think that's a one-dimensional version of presentism, and there's more to it. And I'll try to show the more to it in Dostoevsky's through two short citations from Dostoevsky's Bezi, or in the good old Constant Garnet translation, they say the possessed, and I think Dugin explicitly even says that possessed is acceptable translation, even though it's not a literal translation. So in one scene, we get this dialogue. I'm not speaking of madness, of course, she said. That's quite out of the question. This was uttered proudly and resolutely. But there might have been something peculiar, something in that a tendency to some particular way of looking at things. So she's talking about her son, Stravagin, who's the nihilist main character. And then she's kind of saying, oh, maybe there's some strange tendency in his activities. But then here's the more standard one that looks up to what Zizek and Tucker Carlson came out with recently about this election. There's this discussion with this kind of, I think she's most resembles Kristen Stewart of all the characters in Dostoevsky, this Lisa character in The Possessed. And she's having this discussion with Shatov about, she has this project, she's all like hot on the idea of how does it put impartiality. Like we can, it's the idea is like she's going to select a bunch of newspaper articles from recent years and put them together in a digest, and then people can inform themselves and be impartially informed, and it will be help to everyone. And so she's saying, or actually, so Shatov is saying to her, we're trying to like make clear what her thought is, because she's a little bit unclear about what she expressing, how to express what she wants to do. So it would amount to something with a tendency, a selection of facts with a special tendency, he muttered, still not raising his head. And then she responds, not at all. We must not select with a particular bias, and we ought not to have any political tendency in it, nothing but impartiality. That will be the tendency. So there's a nice little, at the end where she says impartiality will be the tendency, I think there's a nice little Dostoevskian touch where he makes very clear, like, impartiality can also be construed as a tendency. So it's like, it relativizes it, right? It's like, what's your, so there's always a tendency.
Okay, yeah. I see what you're saying. So, I suppose where to take it next from this, because I want to kind of structure this a little bit to give it a little bit of
well, maybe we could discuss the recent American History Association kerfuffle, so-called.
Okay, so explain that. What's that?
So like this guy, James Sweet, who was the head of the American History Association, who was basically a leftist, and he did a lot of work on African diaspora. And I think he's a white guy, so far as I can tell, but he's well liked by his African American colleagues. And he made some criticism of the 1619 project, which was basically like a newspaper thing, a New York Times thing. New York Times is this horrible New York Times thing, and basically his criticism, it seemed to me, was just like, this is just schlock. It's like, it's horrible. And it's like what you said, it's like it was totally politically motivated. It's totally like, oh, we're multiculturalists, we're just going to make stuff up and write this article and pass it off as history. So his problem was really that it was bad. It was bad history from the point of view of the standards of the American History Association and those professors. It was like, it wasn't really that he was going into the, as Hegel would call it, the higher criticism issue. Let me just throw this in. I'm constantly throwing in things that aren't quite opposite, but it's like they add up. So it's like Leo Strauss has suggested that somebody make a comparison between Hegel's three forms of history, the originary or history written by people that were there and participated in it. The reflective, which is basically like regular academic history, like this guy's doing. And then there's a third thing that he calls the higher criticism, which affects Nietzsche quite a bit. Julius Wellhausen and other people doing biblical criticism and stuff like that is involved. And then there's a fourth thing, which is basically Hegel's philosophy, which he calls philosophy of history, which is just thinking over history in a special way. And so I think this guy, James Sweet, stays with the academic history, and then he criticizes people that are for doing poor, like that quote said, like doing partial, like impartiality just sort of means like there's a left-wing version, a right-wing version, and you're neither. But that doesn't really mean that you're, it's just you're impartial between those two parties, but that doesn't mean you're telling the truth. There's still a tendency, there's still a bias, there's still a prejudice, but it's just impartial from the perspective of the factions or whatever. And then like some people, some people got upset about Sweet's criticism of the 1619 project because it's like a Rachel Maddow type of thing or whatever, MSNBC type, and it's against like the I don't know, the Fox News or the conservative version. And there was some dispute, and then some people, there was a guy called Malcolm Foley who did a little response piece to it where he said W.E. Du Bois, I think around 1900, went to a town where there was a lynching, and after the lynching, he saw in the shop window the fingers of this guy that was lynched, like in the shop window for sale or something. And then he said to himself, well, I can't just do a report of this. I have to have like a moral view of it. I have to, push towards one thing or another. And so that's kind of like, there's a problem that there's not one, there's what is Historia for? And like, two, what are the different versions that are legitimate and illegitimate?
Yeah.
And
Well,
so on.
So like we could like say there's two different sides then. The kind of supposedly impartial view of history, at least insofar that it doesn't use history in order to justify like current political trajectories. It's like academic history. It's looking at history from a kind of neutral insofar as that it's not consciously trying to incorporate it into a present
right, not consciously. That's the big problem. Yeah, that's one of the problems.
Yeah. So
I mean, it suggests there is unconscious.
Yeah.
Even though you're not consciously doing it, there's still unconscious.
Okay, so like that's good. So then we have two different. Then we have two different distinction. Then a kind of conscious and an unconscious presentism, if that makes sense.
Within regular academic history. And so like if you look at Samuel Moyn, and there's a guy that's come out with a book that's like really hot right now. It's like he's displacing the who's that terrible guy that wrote the guy that wrote Sapiens and
Nova Harari. So that
Harari. Him. He's like totally denounced Harari as an idiot. And he's denounced Steven Pinker, and the older guy is Jared Diamond, who wrote a kind of book on this. And that's his name written here. But anyway, his book was called his book is called something like The Origins of Prehistory.
Okay,
it's just come out. But he's kind of a colleague of Samuel Moyn on the left, and they do, history of concepts. But it's discernible that all those historians, even though they're not even just doing regular academic history, they're kind of doing the higher criticism, because they're critical, they're not just doing history in the sense of like, there's a recent book by a Finnish guy that's more like, I would call it unbiased version. It was just like, but it still has huge biases, but it's not like it's not political. It's called Indigenous Continent, where he's like Hämäläinen is a Finnish guy, Pekka Hämäläinen, and he's like included all this this records of what the indigenous people were thinking, during the conquest and when Cortez was coming in, and the whole thing all leading up through to the American Revolution and so on. And he doesn't mention any of these questions of concepts or higher criticism issues. It's just like more like the academic history version. But it's like, nonetheless, you can see, even though he doesn't have a political tendency, so to speak, you kind of feel like behind it, there's all these bias issues sneaking up, the unconscious bias, and just the fact that multiculturalism is the big thing. Let's get the view of all these different people, and that will be a better. It's like there's a theoretical question. What is the best way to do history? Is it to continuously try to get as many voices as possible, or is it to get the voices of the people that were the essential actors in history, like Ataturk? Ataturk made this remark: if the man who writes history is unfaithful to the man who makes it, humanity will be deprived of the truth. So it's like Ataturk who carried out this revolution against the Ottoman Empire, and so on, with the aims, with certain specific aims of like bringing in citizen participation and so on. So like he's saying, like, if the historian doesn't understand what he was doing, and he's supposed to be the main guy, then they won't understand that historical event, because like like Bernard Montgomery, the battle general, the British battle general who never lost a battle during World War I or World War II, has said like war is history, and history is built up on war. And so this, like, if there's an essence of history, and it's to be determined in some way, then this constantly going out and looking at oral histories and getting more and more voices and including more and more angles is not necessarily getting us closer to the crux of what we're trying to account for in a history book. So there's all kinds of questions.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so maybe just to touch on the whole, going into history without like a clear-cut political desire, but like having these unconscious inclinations. I was thinking a little bit of two different figures when we were talking about this. Steven Pinker, who has this view of history where he goes into history he's got this very, very positive, very optimistic, linear view of history. He's always inclined to highlight the particularities of history, which make living in the Middle Ages seem horrific. Look at the torture they did to people, the punishments to people, the disease, the lack of hygiene. There's like, yes, he's picking up on particular facts which are probably true, or at least roughly true. It's not exactly like he's making this up or he's gotten it factually wrong, but there's a sort of larger frame, or what's the Heideggerian term you have here for frame?
Stellung, or
no.
Gestell.
Gestell. I'm not sure if I'm misapplying that, but there's a larger frame in which you're sort of going into history with. So it's like when you're making this journey into the past, you're not going there like I'm walking down the street going to the supermarket, and I see like a car. That's okay. I've discovered something. It just happened to be there. Whenever an academic historian is going into the past, they're always going there for a reason. Like they're still going for a human reason. That like they're going. It's kind of difficult for them to just go purely neutrally into the past. Whenever you go into the past, you're always motivated.
That's one of Nietzsche's. When Nietzsche says why, with Nietzsche's famous question, why science is like that, because it's like science is ultimately, even though it presents itself as a neutral activity, it's ultimately a human activity. I think the Stellung, when Heidegger talks about it, is like we take physics to be the ultimate authority on reality, and it's like if it's spontaneous, then it's not like it's like we're doing the higher criticism of our concepts, but it's what strikes us immediately as the reality.
Yeah. And there's another, there are certain things which start to make sense then, because if you think of someone like Graham Hancock, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Graham
I don't know
Hancock.
that.
Well, okay, so he's like this ancient, kind of ancient civilization historian, and I don't think he's even academically trained as a historian. I think he was like a journalist at first, but he got really into kind of ancient civilizations, and his view is anyway that there was ancient civilizations, such as in South America, and they were catastrophically destroyed with these major climate events or these major shifts in climate or big, I don't know, big catastrophic like
That wiped out the mega
yeah.
fauna and so on. Yeah, like there used to be like giant sloths in South America, and then those climate things wiped out, changed the whole.
Yeah.
A lot of
But
things.
like you're not talking incremental changes in climate, you're talking like
Sudden
catastrophic.
catastrophic event.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So like for example, there's
like
another
a
guy.
meteor hitting and things like yeah.
Exactly, like a meteor or like a big glacial eruption that like hit a glacier through a certain area, and so there's another guy that he works with a lot. They're always on the Joe Rogan podcast, and this guy is like a geologist, and he'll say, "Oh, like if you look at this picture and you see like a valley or you see like a whatever topography of some sort." What we're told is that developed incrementally over like erosion of climate and on shifting plates and all this stuff. He's like, no. That happened in like, a few weeks or something. Like a comet hit, a big glacier just wiped out that, like just caused like a hole, like a valley, like a big glacier like went through a mountain and caused like a valley, a gap in the middle, something like this, right? I'm not an expert on this stuff, obviously, but and I thought this is kind of interesting that it's like somehow controversial. It's like like within that area
Well, I
of
think
science, it's very
because
controversial.
all normal science looks for the typical cases, and if you have extreme outliers, it just destroys your science. It just ruins the science. It just becomes useless. But there's a huge amount of investment in normal science
Yeah. Well, see, that might be the reason it's controversial then,
because
because
that's
of
how
the
we predict stuff.
yeah, because of the investment, because you're investing, like the generations and generations of knowledge building. But it's like, and this guy comes along, it's like, well, what if that just happened in one day? What if a big comet hit that? It's like, it's kind of, you know
I
what I
feel
mean?
like the same stuff happens with scientific theories, like theory of evolution.
Yeah.
It goes on and on and on, and then this biologist this English biologist Hamilton comes along and it says the idea of fitness doesn't really make sense. It's like even Dawkins accepts this. It's like it doesn't really, because there can be all kinds of crazy cases. So it's like all scientific theories only function as long as you kind of cage in a normal distribution of things that happen in a regularity,
Yeah. So like,
and then
this
get
is,
this order and progress version of it that's on the Brazilian flag, because that was the just in this 1870 period, that was the big thing. Like, okay, we can now achieve scientific clarity and make progress,
yeah,
like
exactly.
clean stage-wise progress.
Yeah, like there's a kind of developmental building. You can get this knowledge. You can create a kind of platform which you can jump off to create more knowledge and so on and so forth. And I suppose if you do anything which undermines the platforms, they get annoyed. Obviously, but yeah. So that's uh, there's also, I think, kind of research method problems within the institutions, because I do think what happens with scientific research, unlike philosophical thought, is like in the sense of like the kind of continental philosophy, is that you do have this investment, this kind of prior
Yeah,
investment into something. With philosophy, you can jump straight back to the roots and go, oh, what's justice? Let's talk about it. And you're
and
kind of doing philosophy.
it's not just an intellectual investment, but like I think of this Hassenfelder, I forget, this physicist that does the podcast, like she came out with something recently on this subject. Like she was making some suggestions of changes for the way we should study physics, and they were totally ignored and stonewalled kind of and part of the reason is just not just that people have built their whole careers on string theory or whatever the thing is, or something else, but it's also because in financial and research program terms, physics is not something done by like a couple people. It's like it's huge money outlays to build these super colliders and other such.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of industry and other influences there as well. Yeah. So there's a different kind of journey to philosophy and science
But
in
you
that
know what?
sense.
I would say that's true of philosophy too, because
Okay.
like I remember hearing Donald Rumsfeld say, like often, Rumsfeld's this figure of the right in America, the right politics, and he would say, um, often business leaders and politicians would be amenable to some philosophic notion, but it's just that they're so used to doing it the way they're doing it, they don't want to give up a position that they're kind of at least able to handle with the risk that, especially with the risk that they personally would be, things will go bad for them if they change.
Yeah. Well, I
There
think
is an investment. There is a collision of philosophies and the like I don't know the empirical situation or whatever, like what
yeah,
people are politically invested in.
yeah.
But though, just as a pure philosopher, when you're not thinking about how, in the Dugin type of way, have how philosophy must influence actual events. Yeah, I agree with.
There
Yeah,
is
I
the
appreciate what you're saying
capacity
on
of
that level.
the philosopher in
Yeah,
that sense to just go back to the pure
I mean, even
question.
the physicists could do that
Yeah,
too. But it's like there's the same problem. They could just be ignored. It's like because they
yeah,
don't have access to the super collider, which costs so much money.
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So, all right. So that's the kind of scientific uh, discourse. But I wanted to also touch on the kind of epistemic kind of the phenomenology and the kind of epistemic gap between people in different time periods. So something I was thinking about at the start of the conversation was this kind of Spenglerian idea. And I'm not well read on Spengler, but I listen to someone called Academic Agent sometimes who's a bit of a Spengler fan, and he's quite good on this stuff. And he says, that like you have different time periods, even though for Spengler it's circular or it's cyclical. You have like
Spengler is like. Let me just interject that
yeah, okay,
Spengler is kind of neo-Hegelianism. He just takes
okay.
Hegel and then he runs it in a different way. Except he rejects that we're in the absolute. Hegel says, "Oh, everything is relative to the time, but it's okay because we're in the absolute moment." Or
Hmm.
Spengler says, like everyone else, Spengler says, "No, we're not at that absolute moment," but he still keeps the
Hmm.
relativity to the time.
Okay, so yes, so um, something else academic agent talks about a lot is the kind of what he calls the boomer truth regime, which is the kind of episteme, we could say. It's the episteme of our time in the post-war period. And I do think that there's something to this kind of historical experience, this historical particularity. Um, the people that were the children of that time, the children of the summer, as Spengler calls it. Then you have the children of the winter and children of the spring and children of the autumn. But it's like we're now like if you're a millennial or a Zoomer, I'm starting to recognize in just talking to older people or just thinking about the way people older think, whether that be personal, relatives or friends or just people in politics or anything, that there is such a radical, even between two generations. I suppose in modernity things change faster. It increases the distinction between generational epistemes like much more than it would be in like the Middle Ages or something, right? But there's such a radical kind of inclination, prejudice kind of frame that we seem to have if you're a millennial or Zoomer compared to the Boomers. And I think you're really seeing a lot of the politics around that come out now because the Boomers seem to be really incapable. Other than Boomers, I mean the general kind of Boomer post-war episteme, those who kind of are have authority within that and kind of
Well, give it a
see,
specific illustration. Yeah, this give it.
yeah.
It was a person in the public. It was a public intellectual that represents that.
Some people would say Fukuyama. I'm not sure. I think Steven Pinker, maybe.
Oh
Um,
yeah, well, Yeah, Pinker is terrible, I think, but Fukuyama is the more sort
But
of at least more in the region of like prejudice, but not totally stupid prejudice.
well, I suppose it's also just the kind of bombardment of catastrophes, and I think the Ukraine situation is a good example of this because you have this clearly shifting geopolitical situation, not as geopolitical, also domestic, of unipolar to a multipolar world and so on. And it seems like the kind of the kind of Bidens and the equivalents in the EU, it's not even that they're politically invested in it or they're economically invested in something. They seem to be unable to understand that a sort of historical shift has happened and that what they could do 20, 30, 40 years ago doesn't work anymore. They seem to not be in the same time zone as the
Yeah, it's
actual.
interesting that like Nick Kissinger read Spengler and he had Nixon read it, and but part of why they liked it is because they think there's this French historiological term longue durée where they think they could find longer term historical trends within the that go beyond the single generation shift, and that they could that could help them guide their policy decisions. So Nixon operated on that basis.
Yeah. Well, I don't think, yeah, but I think the generational schism at this stage for us anyway has gotten too deep. It's too
No, it's
bad.
extremely
It's
important, and it's like that was what's back behind Heidegger. Okay, there's a guy called Count Paul York who's probably the first to really identify this intergenerational thing. And it's like and then Heidegger picked up on that, and it's probably maybe it's a phenomenon of liberalism properly in the sense of like the Biedermeier period, the rise of the bourgeois, the rise of the national liberals in Prussia, and this kind of period leading up to the Franco-Prussian War, because there was a belief in I think they call it freien Wissenschaft, so it's like free science as being superior to what the church taught or what anyone else thought. And it also it was philosophical movement, but it was it's terrible grammar wise because they wouldn't use the word elite at the time because they had more respect for the leaders of the country in Prussia at the time. But like the lawyers and the professors and people like that were national liberals, which meant in a large way they were against Catholics as universal liberals in a way. But yeah, their thing was the free science, and then approaching the year 1900, freien Wissenschaft become wertfrei Wissenschaft, which is to say value-free science, and that's a huge watershed. And I suppose you could show, in that period, Fathers and Sons, the Russian book, which is about generational change from the old beliefs to a more like engineering, Samuel Harris type of thinking. So this whole thing of generations is Heidegger is very aware of that, and all the people kind of around Heidegger, like Strauss, are very aware of that.
Yeah. Well,
I think what I wanted to say when you're saying that is I think the problem I have with a lot of current commentators is they don't realize that this is not just right now happening, but it's been happening since at least like the 19th century, or at least the latter half of the 19th century.
okay, yeah. So this like, you mean it's happening in the sense of like this more radical generational schisms between
Yeah.
epistemes and yeah, okay, yeah. It does make sense. It does make sense because even the boomers, like, they identified themselves as being very distinct from their parents and their grandparents in a lot of ways. So
And also it's publicly thematized all the time now. We always hear generation Y, generation
yeah,
boomer, generation this, generation that.
it's really big. It's becoming a really big part of discourse. And I remember only like 5, 6, 7 years ago, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was always, if you talked about generational politics, you were kind of seen as it was a bit weird. Like it wasn't standard, but now it's becoming standard because I think people are realizing how distinct the historical experiences are. And I think one of the reasons for that too is also the people that are growing up in the era of smartphones, for example, they don't know what the world was like before smartphones, and I find that quite strange, because like I experienced, like the transition. And like I feel like that's a very useful historical reference point, because that's like, oh, I remember the world before these stupid things came out, and like it was better in many ways. And then these
Well,
younger
I was
people
thinking that
are
myself when
not
I
going to
was
be able to
watching
know
these
that.
old episodes. So there's an
Yeah,
American sitcom called Three's Company, and
yeah.
it's like it's in the 70s, and it's like there's just nothing of there's no computing devices, there's no cell phones. It's like totally different, and it's kind of nice. It's like takes place in LA, and it's like, yeah, I was just thinking just what you're saying in a way.
Yeah, yeah. But like, if you have a reference point for the time before technology came out, you can make a kind of evaluation what was better. But if you don't have that reference point, then your kind of your thought process, the way you think, is going to be so fundamentally different to that.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the question I've been raising of this, like how many generations of cell phones can there be? Because they're always supposedly more optimized, but it seems like once you accept that there's a cell phone optimization as something desirable, then it's infinite. It's like a romantic thing, like Fried nach Unendlichkeit. It just goes on forever, and maybe in 500 years there'll still be a better cell phone.
Although I think at this stage, though, I think we've reached the end of history with cell phone, cell phone innovation. Because I remember, like when I was a
But
kid,
anyway, there's a desire for it because
there's
people
a
accept as a matter of course that cell phones are
yeah.
good and we must have them, and why not make them better?
Well, by making them better, it seems like the past 5 years has just been like the camera is a bit better or something. Whereas like 10 years ago, it was like it went from a flip phone to a touch. It was like really radical changes. Where now it's more just like
Yeah, yeah.
it's got more apps. Like it's not a significant. It's kind of leveled off. The kind of rapid change is leveled off into this kind of touch into the smartphone world.
That's
And
just computers in general. I mean, yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I grew up using kind of like the first home computers, like
yeah.
486 computers, they called them. And it's like, yeah, that's once you get like, I don't know, there's not that, once you get like YouTube and a few things, but there is kind of a gradual increase. I don't know.
There
I haven't
definitely
really
is
thought it through that
probably
clearly.
a gradual increase, but I think there's also like a kind of sudden change and then a leveling off kind of thing, and then a
Yeah,
sudden change, leveling off, because definitely like the late
depreciating
2000s,
returns or something. Yeah.
yeah, like 2010 to 2015, and like a lot of political and social kind of maladies can be traced back to them. So, for example, I don't know if you know Jonathan Haidt. He's like a kind of social psychologist guy. He's kind of popular he's kind of more in the mainstream kind of, but he does have some interesting observations, and he shows the research of when smartphones came out, for example, and like all these teenagers suddenly had this massive spike in like mental health problems, and you know it does make sense because, as he points out,
Online bullying, and so
yeah,
yeah, and
your
also
your
like
whole
I
life
guess
is
young
public.
girls comparing themselves to the
Yeah, to the
people,
most
and
beautiful
yeah, there's
girl
a lot
in
of factors in it. Yeah,
yeah. There's a lot of, and like it changes the whole social like dating apps, for example. Like it changes the whole social, the whole kind of
and then you,
social
yeah, you look
modality.
people up, and how do I my profile reflect me? Where is my
Yeah,
standing, and where am I in the
always
pecking
waiting for
order, and so
texts,
on.
and like it also creates this expectation for people to constantly be in communication with each other, because it's like you can't, it's like I don't text people a lot on my phone. I have a very kind of like old man kind of use of my phone. It's just for practical reasons. But like some people, I see friends and whoever, like who are constantly texting people, constantly texting
It's
this person.
actually impossible though to experience that from both sides because you're only that age once. So
Yeah,
either you experience that age with the cell phone thing and the online Facebook profiles or whatever, or you didn't. So like I was prior to that, so I don't really. It's hard to project myself into that situation as for like a preteen or something.
yeah, but like that's the whole psychodevelopmental angle to it, because like psychodevelopmental processes really do determine how we turn out in many ways. And I think you know if you're developing with this technology or you're developing without that technology, you're going to end up being different people, even if you're from the same country, the same class, the same town. You know what I mean? You might even have the same political opinions, but you're gonna have a different developmental experience, and that's definitely something we're
And also,
realizing
there's
now.
strange cases because there's like cell phones in third world countries where they don't have like running water, but they have cell phones.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's just globalization as well. You know, it's going to give everyone a smartphone, but it's not going to give them running water or so. That's the kind of dark side of globalization. But yeah, so maybe we could switch into a different angle on this whole presentism thing. So you said you had a Nietzsche reference or a Nietzsche angle.
Yeah.
What's
So I
that?
mean, one thing with regard to Spengler, like with it, there's um, the very title Unzeitgenase Betrachtungen, which is usually translated as something like untimely reflections. But as I was saying, I think it could be translated as observations not in keeping with the time. When Spengler has this concept of contemporaneity, where he says like there can be things that are chronologically totally different civilizations at different times, which are contemporaneous in a different sense, in the sense that they're um, um, the prejudice. I guess, and from Nietzsche's point of view, the prejudices they had would be the same, um, or maybe the forces working on them would be the same. But just to say that Nietzsche, I think, in the fundamental idea of will to power, is it's promising to look at it in terms of just like what that means is that the specific coloring of a specific age um, is even in the best case, that specific coloring of the specific age will be behind what people's projects are and what they set themselves. Um, I have I could say something that I have a citation from a guy that's working at this from the point of view of historians bringing out the problem, but let me read something from Heidegger quickly. This is from his lectures during the war, and he's answering Schelling. You remember Zizek? Zizek makes this nice metaphor where he says, "I, Zizek, my whole philosophic enterprise happens in German idealism," and he links it by transfer of meaning. He links that up to Kim Novak looking at a cross section of a redwood tree and saying, "Here I was born, and here I died," because she's like somebody's hired her to pretend to be some woman who died earlier in order uh, uh, carry out a murder and get Jimmy Stewart to be like a prop in the background of it or whatever. But the question is then how do we know when we're in a specific prejudice and specific age, and how can thought kind of like break us out of this? And then Schelling says, well, okay, this problem is really big, but maybe instead of always doing it by looking at history, let's forget about history and just look at nature. And then this is Heidegger's statement answering that. He says, yet does this hold straight away for our time as well? Or is this time, our time, a different one? Which law then requires that thinking conform to its time? Or is thinking ultimately and indeed always and necessarily so? But how could this be the case if ultimately were but the inversion of the if ultimately but were the inversion of time a still fiercer dependence on time? So like Nietzsche has understood himself as the stepchild of the time. Hegel speaks of the child of the time. He just thinks he can break away from his specific time and be a stepchild. But this is Heidegger saying, well, wouldn't that still be determined by the time because you're,
Yeah,
you're
yeah, yeah.
in
That's
fight
actually
with the
quite
time?
good. Yeah, I like that. I like that. That's a good way of stepchild at the time because Nietzsche is trying to subvert certain historical trajectories which have been going on. Like he's reactionary in a very specific sense, to the things which have been causing the last man, basically, which we could talk forever about what those were. For him, he was
Well,
19th
also,
century.
so like
But
Spengler has it. Spengler is determined by this whole last man idea, and that he says Nietzsche is just a romantic. Nietzsche thinks we can cease to be uh, this lesser mensch, and we could, he mentions this example of the centurion at Pompeii who stayed at his station and was annihilated by the explosion of Vesuvius, because this is like using the human possibility not to just merely seek bare life and to just drift like a Egyptian fellahin, a peasant farmer who just like wants to eat and raise their children and just like drift around and with no specific aim. But we could have some aim which would be higher than that. But Spengler kind of thinks, oh, that's just a romantic notion of Nietzsche, but the less dimensions here, and we're all the last man, according to Spengler. Okay, but that's just interjection.
Yeah. So I agree. Yeah, Nietzsche does have a kind of I'm not sure romantic is the way I would put it, but he does have
Well, I mean, I just think that's how Spengler looks at it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but like
I don't
he
think
definitely
anybody.
does
I don't think we're
yeah.
required to take Spengler all that seriously. That Spengler is he has his opinion, but
Spengler's
it's not necessarily that
invested.
authoritative.
Yeah. He's invested in a certain cyclical model, which would be, so you have these kind of moments or like it's interesting actually. I'll bring up Lenin here because Zizek is says that Lenin had this kind of temporal understanding of like the opportunity. And I think he even says he's kind of got a Kierkegaardian kind of capacity for like opportunity. And that, like, it is true that, for example, there's a general trajectory of a civilization or a historical, forces which are going a certain way. But there are also these gaps in the fence, we could say. And there's these moments where a certain more conscious intervention could alter that, or create an opening or alter that movement, that direction. And I definitely think that that's where I would stand on it anyway, that there is an overarching kind of
Well, I mean,
deterministic
that's
force,
the
but there's
ancient Greek
gaps.
concept,
There's
right?
gaps,
Yeah. There's chronological time, and then there's time of opportunity, and the rhetors especially were associated with the time of opportunity, which is like also the original logic is just like what's presentism? We're talking in public about it. What's the concept of presentism all about? And then just the discussion gives us a chance to have these times of opportunity where we could like maybe alter the time,
yeah.
maybe alter the zeitalter that we're in.
And like it mightn't even be a successful intervention. It could be a failed intervention, which and this is another kind of Zizekian point. It could be like a failed intervention, which then creates the capacity or opening for a successful intervention further down the line. So
Oh yeah,
you got two Caesars,
that's a Rosa Luxemburg thing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
The failed attempt opens up to the successful attempt.
That is, and like that might be a bit of a romantic way of looking at it, but I don't know. There's something to that. I think there's something to that.
I mean, I think there's illustrations of it in history, but and even I guess even in the Bolshevik Revolution is like that.
Yeah, definitely. Because the Bolshevik Revolution also upset the assumed pattern, which was that you had to go from a agricultural medieval society to a industrial society to a bourgeois industrial society to the communist society. But then Russia and Cuba and all these other countries made this big leap from the earlier society to the communist society, and that completely offended the assumed trajectory which the development of communism.
The teleology of
the teleology.
It's like this. They use the term Whig history or teleology in connection to this type of stuff, and it's like even Zizek slipped up, who sort of should know better. There was one like informal discussion he was having where he said, Oh yeah, just what you said. Just they could have developed normally, but instead, we suffered this, this terrible catastrophe of the Bolshevik Revolution.
Mm.
But what is it? Well, what is there really a developing normally? That's one of the whole big. I think in Fukuyama too, that's one of his big themes. But is there and Dugin? Is there a normal scheme of development, or the different countries have their own special path and so on?
Mm. Yeah. Well, I definitely think that there is a kind of uh, uh, within a globalized technological and economic system, I think there definitely are you kind of widespread global forces pushing a certain trajectory. For example, Asia, like the wealthy Asian countries, do assume a sort of distorted version of a kind of Western relationship towards like money and technology.
It's
It's
like
different. It's
Fukuyama talks
different.
about the defensive modernization. They have to, like, some of them
Yeah, yeah.
decide, oh yeah, we'll get in on this, and then we'll because we have to. But then there's like this schism where, I mean, I think this is maybe the biggest schism in the Muslim world, is that Saudi Arabia and some other people are in with America, and they're like, okay, we're fine with going high tech, and they've founded some King Abdullah University in Saudi Arabia with a huge, many billion-dollar endowment to research science and to try to get to Nobel Prizes in sciences in Saudi Arabia. And they hate the Muslim Brotherhood and the people. They staged a coup in 2014 to remove the lawfully elected Muslim Brotherhood from office in Egypt, and bring in this General Sisi, who they paid like, I don't know, some ungodly sum, like 25 billion to carry out this coup, and then with following payments. But it's basically because they don't want, because the Muslim Brotherhood is like for something else. They're not for the defense of modernization. They're for some kind of, Muslim Ummah or something, like more like
Mm.
Iran, even though Iran is a different brand of um, Islam than they are, but they're still more in line with Iran. So like, I think the people that are more teching up are more in line with the so-called, what Dugin would call collective West.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, true. Um, so there's another angle I suppose we could look at this from, which is um the incapacity for contemporary people, which always means everyone when they're around, to I think particularly after the kind of end after World War II and after the end of history, to not understand the sort of schism between people that existed prior to the end of World War II or prior to the kind of fall of the Berlin Wall end of history moment. So, for example, the example I use here is um, Margaret Thatcher thought she was Churchill, and she kind of thought that she was like the reincarnation of Churchill, and she, you know, it, leaned in at the time. It was like 70s, 80s, Britain. She leaned into this feeling that they were, no longer the big empire, no longer a global superpower, and they were no longer sort of they were no longer significant. They don't they suddenly lacked a historical
Well, how can
purpose.
she be Churchill and be no longer
Well, no, like
the big?
like she's tapping into the feeling that that is the case in the general public. Um, and she's trying to create like a project of like
I see,
rehistory,
negotiate with the actual, yeah,
rehist.
public feeling.
Yeah, yeah. She's trying to broaden it and like
Ex tempore, out of the time, tried to
mm,
use the real feeling and guide it in some.
yeah, like she's trying to rehistoricize England at the time. Yeah, and so I was watching a documentary about this just last night because Adam Curtis is quite good documentaries on this, and he's one on Thatcher, and it's funny because it was a complete failure. Um, After World War II, England was already totally in debt to the US in order to bankroll all of the munitions to stand up to the Germans and not negotiate with Hitler and so on and so forth. So They were already completely in debt. And it was basically like, like their destiny to just be not no to basically become irrelevant, no longer
And it's
a
like we'll be
superpower was.
irrelevant, but we won't because we'll league up with the United States.
Well, yeah, and in doing so, they subdued themselves to being irrelevant. So it's like a kind of tragic. It's a deal with the devil. But what's interesting about that time is that is this kind of rehistoricization campaign that she conducted, and like they even started like sculpting famous British historical figures, making sculptures out of them and putting them up in parks and all this kind of stuff. They started reinvigorating kind of countryside towns that had certain historical significance and all this kind of stuff. And what actually came about through her was like the civil war
To
in
build
northern.
national feeling or something. That's like
Yeah,
one
yeah.
of Nietzsche's.
But like
Yeah,
not
it's like the
just a
one of Nietzsche's
national feeling,
versions of
but
history.
like a national feeling specifically from people who felt that they no longer had an historical identity or historical trajectory, and to reinvigorate that historical identity. And as Adam Curtis pointed out, that what she ended up doing, actually, particularly in Northern Ireland, was just reinvigorating someone else's historical identity and causing a civil war. So, like, anyway, it was a complete catastrophe. It was a complete fucking catastrophe.
Oh yeah, it's kind of like there's a sense that in this country, like the paleo conservatives have this thing like diversity is a weakness, and being united is a strength. And then like she's trying to unite people, but she's creating these diversities, right?
Exactly. She's creating all these distinctions between like working class people and middle class people, because she's like being harsh on the unions and shutting down mines and all this kind of stuff. She's selling off she's sold off the water supply, and I think the rail. I'm not sure the exact details, but she's privatizing stuff. She's pissing off the working classes. She's pissing off the Irish. She's pissing off everybody, and creating this like new historical identity. And it was kind of a complete catastrophe. And I think one of the reasons that it was a complete catastrophe, I was thinking about this, was because she basically said, I'm going to give you a new historical identity purely based off of like the appearances of we're English again, we're back in the empire, wave the flag around, we're going to send the troops off to the Falklands, blah blah blah. And like there's absolutely no sense of historical struggle within the recreation of that identity. So like a traditional view of how people emerge historically would be there's some sort of struggle which they overcome, and through that struggle become who they are, who they were meant to be. This is the very Hegelian view, obviously, right? And so for example, the Greeks, the struggle of standing up to the Persian Empire and so forth, and all the rest, kind of created their suffering and their misfortune sort of created the opportunity for their overcoming. What you see, I think, in the post-war period, and I think that Trump is a little bit similar. I think that even wokeism is a little bit similar. Like you could be revolutionaries again. You could be like, you could be like civil rights activists again. It's like creating these like rehistoricizing people, like without the struggle. You know what I mean? Like without the kind of fundamental.
Well, it's like just the statues and the
Yeah,
flag and the hat of some guard or something like
exactly.
that.
Yeah, it's a
Just
kind
to
of.
feel like you're comfortable and like here's these traditions and we're living in them and we recognize ourselves or something.
Yeah. We sort of recognize ourselves as something which was created through struggle, but we're not going to have the struggle. It's kind of like Zizek's, I want the coffee without caffeine. I want the beer without
Well, I mean, I
alcohol.
don't
So,
know it from your perspective as being in
yeah.
the UK, but like what I always hear about Thatcher is, oh, she's a neoconservative, and then it's kind of like in this country we have people like Thomas Sowell, and what they always say is like, oh, this way of doing economics is more productive, and it's like, but it's more productive, but it's also it concentrates money at the top, so it's like it's almost like um within the last man thing, there's like the last man is like all the bourgeois who have their aspirations is just like to open a small shop with a service or something, or some small
Mm.
um, economic independence. But then what it leaves out is over above that, there's this asset holding class, which, according to what I always hear when I hear about the name of Thatcher and Clinton's sort of neoliberalism, and that it creates the what we always hear about, the the divide between the 1% and everybody else. So that it's almost seems, when I'm listening to you, I'm wondering if Thatcher was really mainly aimed at that, and then there's just like this addition or something.
Yeah, no, like I think you could, like, practically, if you were a kind of consequentialist thinker, you said, like, what's the consequence of her actions? Yes, 100%. Her destiny was basically to, um, ironically enough, actually disempower a lot of the middle classes, the lower middle classes that she was kind of speaking to at the time. In the long run, she economically and socially disempowered them, actually, but in the moment, and I don't think it was disingenuous. I think she genuinely believed it, and I think there's a lot of people in England at the time who genuinely believed that there was a real sense of, we no longer have a kind of historical purpose or historical identity, and she sort of gave them a very brief kind of basically deranged moment where they could sort of LARP, like live action role play,
Well, I
as
guess I
if
feel like,
the empire was
yeah,
back. But actually what was practically happening was that the empire was anything left of it was being undermined and destroyed. But they were so caught up in the kind of psychology of the feeling of that
yeah. I mean, I think
rehistoricization.
that's
It's a
a big
powerful
problem
thing.
I have with the whole Trumper stuff and the whole
Yeah,
right
yeah,
paleoconservatives in America, is I think because they overlook that these are somehow, we're getting caught up to 19th century problems. Like what I was just saying is, it was believed there was something called like freien Wissenschaft or free Wissenschaft, but then that became the wertfreie Wissenschaft, which involves Nietzsche, because it's like value free science, neutral science, which actually doesn't really exist, but it's just like we're doing basic physics, which has no direct human meaning, and then with the hope that it will like improve human life, but it maybe it does as much bad as it does good. And that move from the belief of the, like in the Raj or something, like where we're bringing in law, we're producing some order of some kind. After World War II in Sri Lanka, when the British withdrew, then the Buddhists started slaughtering en masse the Tamils, and all kinds of horrible things happened. A little bit similar to like when the head was cut off in Libya, when Gaddafi was killed by Obama. Then still we have chaos, right? So at least the British were, from our point, it's almost like, at least from our point of view, at least the British were, like from the point of view of this time, which is already accepted kind of in a background way, science and the wertfreie Wissenschaft, or the value-free science. At least they were doing some instrumental thing of keeping order of a crude kind or something. But from the older point of view, from the Freien Wissenschaft point of view, it was like we're promoting the truth, and like we're getting closer to this thing that Hegel was looking for, the genuine Heimat, or homeland of human beings, the truth. So we've
yeah.
lost the belief. We lost the belief in knowledge that could actually genuinely improve whatever the word for the largest civilization, culture, um, the polis, or whatever the word for the largest country entity is.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that one of the major changes in knowledge pursuit, which needs to happen, is to move away from the kind of technological pursuits, and go into the kind of understanding, like why certain declines in a country or a civilization's trajectory happen. Because I kind of think that if you can understand why there's a rise and fall, it's kind of Spenglerian understanding. Like, can you then understand enough in order to create an opening to sort of subvert that trajectory. I kind of have a
Well, see,
suspicion that the Plato was kind of trying to do this because he had actually quite a kind of implicit criticism in a lot of his dialogues. For example, that he would call characters after great men. So, for example, in Lashes, the two main characters who want their sons to be great, they're the sons of Thucydides and I think it's Thucydides and Aristides. So there's these great historical men, and then these other men, their sons and grandsons, who were like, how do we get as good as them? Like, what's the conscious process to like cultivate ourselves to like retaining that kind of excellence that the Athenians had? Because of course the Athenians were in decline at the time Plato was writing anyway. So it was,
well, I don't know if they were in decline, but just to throw it in, like I think my interpretation of Locus is like Socrates is the model that they're really, because both both Nicias and Locus both kind of agree like Socrates is good at war and he's like a good thinker. And then this kind of dispute between Locus, who's like takes the Spartan Dorian view that like there's a specific conceptual issue in there, like that touches on this Wittgenstein grammar issue, which is like the Athenians are using the word Andrea in a specific way, and there's a usage, and it covers a lion also has Andrea, and then who's that? There's Locus, and then there's the other guy. What's the other guy's? Nicias, right?
Yeah,
Nicias, yeah. Nicias comes in and says, "Oh no, I don't think we should use the word Andrea with respect to irrational things like a lion, because Andrea must have an element of wisdom." And then there's this discussion, but ultimately, like the arbitrator above it is the exemplar of Socrates. That's what I think is partially in there. But then there's the problem, like, that this doesn't have any meaning from the point of view of a Wertfrei Wissenschaftler, a technological view, but the technological view goes totally along with. That's what I said this in a recent tweet. It's like if you wanted to make a really big divide, you could say Plato says we must steer the ship of state, and then Milton Friedman says no, the market must determine everything, leave everything alone.
Yeah, exactly. Plato thinks, I mean, it's clear in the Republic, Plato is a kind of utopian, right? He wants to use the capacity for reason to understand how certain declines or ascents in the generations of men happen, so that they can sort of protect and enshrine a certain trajectory to elevate or to at least maintain certain gains that have been gained. And it's very much in the realm of like just cultivating men, like cultivating the good politicians.
And he's already thinking of he has the example of Hesiod, right? He has the example of the theogony and the works and days, and some other things. Because in Hesiod, there's like that different generations of
but like that right there is what I think Nietzsche then invigorates again, because Nietzsche is also doing something similar. He's like trying to understand, the ascents and downfalls of men, and like trying to, the Ubermensch project is a kind of, it's a kind of it's an absurdity in his time, and it's still an absurdity today, I would say. But like it's the capacity to understand the openings to subvert the historical processes, historical forces. If you can sort of understand the openings enough, you might be able to subvert those historical and social forces to create a sort of more conscious trajectory of how human beings should conduct themselves, cultivate themselves, elevate themselves, and so forth. And
maybe like time of opportunity thing that's only human beings can do. But I think like there's also this element, this is a Protagoras element, which is that Socrates in a way already is the Ubermensch. And it's just that Socrates has an idea of how to lead a conversation and how to lead the polis and some recommendations. And then you say like naturally people recognize that and they see that Socrates actually is the superior figure. And then the question would be, if Socrates is examining the nature of the theoi, which are basically like later on through like Thomas and some other people, it gets clarified that the theoi are basically the conscience, like our moral conscience. Well, it's already totally clear in the Euthyphro, but it's like what eudaimonia basically means. The happy conscience or the best sort of internal guidance ship. But the thing that makes it not Übermensch is that it's the proposition that the gods don't philosophize, or which is to say that the what is it questions, like what is it justice, have an eternal answer that's unmoving. And then Protagoras would say the right man, the Socrates figure, or somebody higher than Socrates could discern that and live by it. But the Übermensch is like, no, you never have the truth. You always have something that's like not quite true, but it's still, this is the best guidance.
Okay, yeah.
That's
So
the
like,
way I see it anyway.
well, fair enough. There probably are distinctions between Nietzsche's understanding of this and Plato or Socrates' understanding of this, but I do think that they have something in common, which is that they are looking at certain historical social forces, and that Plato probably wouldn't think of it as historical in the sense we do, but or that Nietzsche did, but some sort of over like intergenerational social forces, which are,
well, like for instance, that technology
us,
improved during the Peloponnesian War with respect to ships and stuff like that. They have examples of change that seem to be a matter of progress. Or actually, the example I always give is that the reason I start Athenian history with Draco is because like it seems the most obvious example. If the good simply means improvement, then the most strong and obvious example of the good is that Draco publicized the laws and promulgated them so everybody could see the laws. And then this seems like an improvement over mafia families having control of the laws and saying what the law is and making up the law as they went along, as Aristotle mentions in some of his writing.
But it's the capacity to recognize the improvement is really important, because if you don't recognize the improvement, then the improvement could be lost. Because I think what happens with like the kind of modern technological improvement is that we don't really recognize things. We just blindly follow a trajectory, and what you're talking about in this example is like a kind of social, kind of practical intelligence, which Aristotle called, I can't remember what he called it, but a practical phronesis, kind of practical intelligence of the capacity to see the improvement and or maybe understand the principles of that improvement in order to like manage that in the right direction to maintain it. And I think that what happens when you can't do that is you inevitably kind of have a stagnant or a kind of declining society or declining civilization. But the problem is today we just think, oh, that means that you have innovative people making things more efficient. It's like, no, that's not what that means. But because that's not a phronesis.
So
that's
like
just a kind
all
of
this I agree. I agree with, and like that's why when I cite that thing of Lisa in the Possessed, and she's all fetched by this notion of the the thing without bias, that this could be the archetype that guides us. But I think that that character is like in a way that's like what I'm calling this toad character, which is like Socrates is kind of like a toad, but Kristen Stewart is also. But Kristen Stewart right now is like, she's into this. I'm not going to be a normie freak or something. I'm going to go against what Hollywood is trying to tell me. I have to be straight or something. I have to be. It's like almost like this 1970s version of feminism, which came out in that Barbie movie. It's just like, we have to be emancipated and we have to be free to be gay or something like that. But I think the same type of personality, if she would get over that stage, that's the type of personality that could bring forth history in a way. And Socrates was obviously clearly an example of